Welcome, everyone. We're going to take another 2 minutes to let people come into the webinar, and then we'll get started. Again, welcome. We're going to get started in another minute with the affordable homes at risk, preservation challenges and opportunities. As you can see in the chat, we're going to be asking everyone to please open up the Q&A button located in the More section of your Zoom bar at the bottom so that we can use that button to answer questions for the panelists, to pose questions and answer them. All right, we are going to get started with the 2026 Affordable Homes at Risk Preservation Challenges and Opportunities webinar. Thank you all for being here. The California Housing Partnership was founded 35 plus years ago now by tenant advocates and tenant attorneys, which most people don't realize about us, who were really concerned at that point with the loss of federally subsidized affordable homes. And that was a huge threat that was happening in the late 80s and 90s after federal changes gutted affordable housing programs. And so the partnership was really founded with an eye towards providing leadership on affordable housing preservation. And it's in that tradition that we are really happy to host this webinar with a lot of help. You're going to be seeing from a range of experts here, not only our own team, but also the folks from Enterprise Community Partners, Housing California, Burbank Housing, Self-Help Enterprises will all be sharing information here. And the format is going to be, you're going to hear first from the experts at the California Housing Partnership on what's at risk and what we're losing. And then we're going to have a case study that's going to be talking about the challenges that we're facing both in traditional subsidized affordable housing and then in a less traditional affordable housing, that is market rate housing, that we're desperately trying to preserve before we lose it all, which is happening at a rapid clip. And then we'll follow those with a policy discussion. And that policy discussion will be a great chance for those of you who have your own thoughts about what we should be doing. And we'll also be hearing from ideas that are currently in play in Sacramento. So that is the agenda for today's session. And I'm going to introduce Associate Research Director Danielle Mazzella, who leads our work on affordable housing preservation, particularly in the subsidized area. That is, what affordable homes that have government subsidies and rent protections are being lost and what's most at risk. Before I do that and turn over to Danielle completely, I do want to just tell one quick story, which is my introduction to the partnership came working side by side when I was working with the city of San Francisco, helping to preserve over 3,000 affordable homes that were at risk then because HUD was withdrawing from the affordable housing space. And the partnership really impressed me, and this was a long time ago, working with nonprofit housing providers in the city, tenant organizers, and we did. We prevailed and we saved, actually, I think it ended up being 3,500 affordable homes at that time. So it is possible to save these homes, and you're going to hear from folks in the field who are doing that very work. With that, over to you, Danielle.
Thanks, Matt. Good morning, everyone. Sarah, can we get the next slide? Oh, there we go. Thank you. So diving right into back to the thank you. Diving right into the subsidized at risk report that we released late last week. This body of work stems from a statewide database of subsidized rental homes that we maintain throughout the state. Given details on ownership and affordability, we assess the likelihood of these developments converting to market rate. You see on the table on the left, statewide, there are more than 590,000 subsidized rental homes, of which more than 3/4 were financed through the low-income housing tax credit program. In the darker shades of purple on the map, you can see where these homes are concentrated, which primarily is in Southern California, with almost half of all subsidized affordable homes, and some other concentrations in the Bay Area, Sacramento, and Kern counties. Next slide. So just some context setting. We like to see what has been lost first before we dive into what's at risk over the next couple of years. Here in this chart, we show the number of homes that have been lost each year by funding agency. So each of these colors represents a federal or state agency for some of the programmatic work for when funding or restricting affordable housing. Between 2001 and 2025, California lost nearly 18,000 affordable homes due to expiring regulatory restrictions and owners' decisions to opt out, sell, or allow their properties to convert to market rate. In the first part of the decade, you can see that a large proportion of these went out between 2001 and 2010, roughly 44%. In the dark blue, here you have the homes lost by housing, financed by Housing and Urban Development. These were loans and project-based rental assistance contracts that have matured, or the contracts were allowed to expire and not renewed by owners. During this initial period in the dark orange, you start to see the loss of the first generation of low-income housing tax credit developments. These predominantly had 15-year affordability covenants. And then later on in the time frame in the orange, you also see these initial generation of tax credits that had the 30 years instead of the typical 55-year regulatory agreements we're accustomed to today. Another large proportion of what we've lost is those that only had local regulatory agreements. So thinking about redevelopment and other sort of programs that just subsidize partial parts of developments, maybe not 100% of all units in a building. And these typically only had 30 years of affordability as well. Next slide. So in the left-hand table, we sort of separate existing subsidized rental units between what's at risk and low risk. At risk are those that may lose affordability within the next 10 years. We've broken this out by program. So just a quick run through of what's represented. We have HUD, so Housing and Urban Development. We have the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. And then we have USDA, which finances farm worker and multifamily developments through Section 514, 515, and Section 521 programs. Then we have the state agencies, CalHFA and HCD, California Housing and Community Development, which have a series of loans and grants that have created affordable housing throughout the state. And then last, local in the green, which represents all of the different programs and land use mechanisms created through jurisdictions to restrict or subsidize affordable homes. Our risk assessment primarily relies on the length of affordability and or the restriction, and then looking at who owns the development. Developments at risk are those that may convert to market rate over the next 10 years, and low risk means there are more than 10 years of affordability, or it is owned by a stable mission-driven nonprofit organization. Again, you can see concentrations of at-risk developments are in Southern California in the darker shades of orange, as well as Bay Area, Sacramento, and Fresno and Kern counties. Of the developments at risk, nearly 3/4 of the homes are in these darker shades, in the counties represented in the darker shades of orange. Counties with the lowest concentrations of affordable homes are seen in the lighter oranges. So you see the Northern State region and Sierra regions, but these also have some of the highest proportions of at-risk developments. The loss of one or two of these developments would significantly impact the ability of lower income renters to find other affordable homes, as these counties may only have had 10 or so developments to begin with. Next slide. In the report, we then break down risk by level and sort of chunk it out in sort of 3 different time horizons. Very high are developments that may convert to market within the year. High is within the next 1 to 5, and moderate in the next 5 to 10. And the colors are also reflected to the same programs that you've seen in the previous slides. And as you saw before, predominantly developments funded through HUD in the dark blue and the low-income housing tax credit in the darker orange make up a majority. Specifically, 8 out of 10 of those that are at risk are funded through one of those developments. At-risk developments with regulatory agreements through local mechanisms are also a growing portfolio, here represented in that green. Many of these only had 30 years of restriction. The gray bar represents the USDA funding. These were developments that have prepayment provisions that give owners the option to apply to prepay at any time, as well as older USDA loans nearing the end of their mortgage terms. For HCD and CalHFA in the yellow and light blue, more than 1,100 affordable homes are also at risk over the next 10 years. We've seen success in recent programs to preserving these developments and hope to see similar programs in the future. With that, I will pass it on to my colleague, Research Manager Matt Alvarez-Nissen.
Great, thanks, Danielle. I'm going to be talking about our other recent at-risk report focused on unsubsidized affordable homes. Next slide, please. So unsubsidized affordable homes, as the name might imply, are all homes that are affordable to low-income renters available on the market. They do not receive any subsidies from government or state program. We, in our report, define unsubsidized affordable housing as properties where at least half of all units in a building are affordable to households making 80% of the zip code median income. Where affordable is defined as a household spending 30% of their income on rent. We've been collecting this data at the property level annually from CoStar since 2020. A couple of important caveats about the data before I get into the findings is that we don't know the actual makeup of the households that live in these homes. And it's entirely possible, although the rents are affordable for lower income households, moderate or above moderate income households actually live in these units. We are also only capturing the 5+ unit stock, so we don't capture those 2 to 4 unit properties in the analysis due to data limitations. But based on existing research, it's likely that there are significantly more affordable units within this universe, especially in duplexes and triplexes. So to our findings, we estimate that there are about 1.08 million existing unsubsidized affordable homes in California. And you can see in the figure that this is significantly more than the share of the state's affordable subsidized housing stock, as Danielle just discussed. And both together still don't quite meet the needs of low-income renter households across the state. But what we can see is that that most low-income people in California live in unsubsidized homes. Next slide, please. Because we track this data at the property level every year, we can also tell when homes have lost their affordability. So this means that their asking rents are no longer affordable at those levels that we described. Across the state since 2020, we estimate that about 268,000 homes lost affordability, concentrated mostly in Southern California, especially LA County, as well as the Bay Area, Fresno, and Sacramento counties. We also found that about half of all homes were lost in higher opportunity neighborhoods, as defined in the TCAC HCD opportunity maps. And the continued erosion of the stock presents a serious challenge to fair housing, as lower income households are denied access to opportunity through the housing market. Next slide, please. And again, because we track this data at the property level and we're able to see where properties have been lost, we've been able to develop a risk model to estimate where we believe remaining unsubsidized affordable housing is at risk of losing their affordability in the near term. So of the about 1.08 million unsubsidized affordable homes, we've identified about 78,000 that are currently at very high risk of losing their affordability imminently. And this is based on individual property risk in the immediate future, using both property characteristics and neighborhood economic conditions to understand risk. In 5 years, we project that 350 to 430,000 homes are at high or moderate risk of losing their affordability. In the chart, you can see that the highest concentrations of at-risk homes are again in Southern California and the Bay Area. Bay Area in particular sees a particularly high concentration of very high risk homes. So these are, again, homes that are imminent risk of losing their affordability. Next slide, please. Taking a look at where at-risk homes are located across the state, these maps show both the raw count of at-risk homes and the share of that county's total unsubsidized affordable housing stock. Unsurprisingly, on the left side, the raw counts concentration again is LA County, Bay Area, Sacramento, and other Southern California counties. But when we look at the share of the total unsubsidized stock that's at risk, the pattern's a little bit different. Smaller inland counties, Central Valley counties face disproportionately high levels of risk. This is in part due to the limited multifamily housing stock available in these counties, but it also points to the fact that different housing market conditions impact a region's unsubsidized stock in different way, and that there are different challenges based on the locality and maintaining affordability for these critical housing units. All right, thank you, and I will pass it back to Matt.
Thanks, Matt. So we have a number of questions that have been posed, and one of them is for unsubsidized affordable rental housing, is the affordability data more robust for jurisdictions that have rent control and rental registry requirements?
Is it more robust in terms of the data quality? I mean, I can try to field this question. We procure the data from a commercial real estate provider, CoStar. So it doesn't really depend on local jurisdictions, rent registries, or their local rent control policies. Local rent control policies are effective at preserving affordability in the existing stock, but in terms of our research directly, those wouldn't necessarily impact data quality.
Thanks. And then we have a question that actually either you or Danielle could answer from Ansul, which is, what does lost mean? Does it demolished, or is it when rent rises above the income limits, or both?
Yeah, I can take that for unsubsidized. It's both. We don't disaggregate in the full report, but it is both demolished and when rents rise above the threshold of affordability.
And for subsidized, predominantly it's about the units no longer being restricted at the specific AMI levels. They are as a small fraction of ones that have been foreclosed or otherwise are no longer habitable, but they remain a small proportion of what we consider lost or what has actually been lost for the subsidized portfolio.
Great. And then a last question, and anyone who has additional questions, please put them in the Q&A. Is the data, including the risk of unsubsidized housing loss, available at the county level?
Yes, it is for unsubsidized.
Okay, and I believe, Matt, you have an appendix in your report that shows by county. Is that
That's
right?
right. That's right.
Okay.
You can check the appendix, and if you have any further questions about jurisdiction level estimates, please feel free to reach out and we can discuss more.
And Danielle, you have a similar appendix in your report that has the data by county.
Correct. The data is available by county. And then for those interested in property level details, we have a great tool, the Affordable Housing and Benefits uh, a calculator map that shows you individual property details for all subsidized in California.
Great. And then we have a question about whether we have data on home ownership that's been units that have been lost or not. Who wants to field that one?
I'll just say on the unsubsidized side, no, it's all rental housing.
Subsidized as well. It's all rental.
Okay, and then we have a question about how is risk measured? Is it based on covenants expiring and market rents pressuring the conversion? Why don't you each talk about, Daniel, why don't you go first about risk on your section?
Risk for the subsidized developments is based on when the affordability restrictions or the other subsidies expire, as well as who owns the development. We lower risk when we know developments are owned by entities that have not only the wherewithal, but the sort of capacity and just mission or interest to continue maintaining these developments as affordable. And so we sort of measure those in tandem and then assign one of the four risk levels.
Great. And I think that also relates to the next question about how do we determine whether a mission-driven nonprofit is stable or not?
We have a really great team of financial consultants that have been working on with the developers and other community-based organizations in developing housing for a long time. And in coordination with them, as well as just relationship building, we've tried to build a comprehensive list of who we think sort of has not only the resources, but the expertise to continue not only operating, but successfully recapitalizing these developments as affordable. Happy to talk more offline if you think we've missed something or have more suggestions on other things we should consider.
And so I'll just add that's we're obviously applying a subjective lens to this. There is no exact science for what is mission driven and what is consistent capacity. But we do know that for example, a single asset corporation that was set up 30 or 40 years ago that has no other housing activities going on is not going to qualify as a likely successful entity at housing preservation. So there is going to be a distinction between an organization that is actively developing affordable housing and preserving it, has a staff and financial capacity to do that, and those that do not. And as Danielle said, we'd love to hear from folks if you think we've missed you. And then there's a question about how many properties are owned by for-profit owners. And I think you both have tables, or Danielle, you do at least in your report. Maybe we could just pop that back up on the screen.
We do, not in the presentation. We do have a graphic that speaks a little bit to this in the PDF reports we published to give sort of a sense. The one I'm talking about kind of roughly specifically talking about what's been lost and how a majority of what has been lost were in fact owned by for-profit owners.
Great, thank you. And then last question we have time for right now. Matt, if you could respond to, for the unsubsidized units, how do you assess risk? And do you have project-specific information as we do for the subsidized units?
Yeah, we do have property-specific information. We have developed a proprietary risk methodology that looks at property level information. Based on previous patterns of loss, we create a model that looks at the conditions in the properties that lost their affordability and finds existing properties that exhibit similar conditions. And so that's both property level conditions related to building quality or characteristics, as well as neighborhood economic conditions related to, you know, change in the economic conditions at the neighborhood level. And so we bring both of these factors together in order to generate risk. It gets a bit complicated. The very high risk category is we run the model during given current conditions. The high and moderate risk categories, we project out at the 5-year mark and run the model again there to see where we think risk will be in the near-term future.
Thank you both very much for the presentations and responding to those questions. And I'll try to respond to the remaining questions in the chat later. But right now, I want to welcome Heather Bromfield, Associate Director of Preservation for Enterprise Community Partners. Heather, thanks so much for being here. And you're going to help us dig in a little bit into what it looks like to preserve some of these unsubsidized properties that Matt N was just talking about. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Matt, and thank you, Matt Alvarez and Danielle, for your deep research that really underscores the importance of finding strategies to preserve affordable housing. So like Matt said, I'm Heather Bromfield, and I'm at Enterprise Northern California, where I lead our preservation team. We're really grateful that CHP has once again invited us at Enterprise to be a part of their Affordable Homes at Risk webinar. I'll start by prefacing the upcoming presentation with the context that last year, there were some major federal changes to low-income housing tax credit policy, which those in the industry refer to as the lowering of the 50% test to a 25% test. And without getting into a lot of the details of what that means, functionally, it means that there's going to be a much greater availability of low-income housing tax credits available. And this potentially opens doors for using tax credits for rehabs in California, including rehabs of previously unsubsidized properties, in a way that hasn't been true for about 6 years, when 4% tax credits became competitive. So our presenter who I'm about to introduce is going to be speaking about a scattered sites project with 90 total homes across 4 different buildings, 3 of which had never previously been subsidized, and then where they're able to use tax credits to preserve those homes as affordable. Our presenter, Rich Wallach from Burbank Housing, is going to share about this project that wouldn't have been possible in the absence of tax credits, and how this financing both prevented homes from losing their affordability in a high-cost tourism-based city, as well as how the project dealt with some challenges. So that said, I'm going to introduce Rich. Rich joined Burbank Housing in early 2019 and brings with him over 40 years of community development experience in for-profit, nonprofit, and public sector areas of real estate and urban redevelopment. Rich has been leading Burbank's efforts in development finance, advocating for regulatory fairness, and developing their pipeline. Prior to joining Burbank, he worked in Chicago for many years, building and financing affordable housing. And thank you so much for being here, Rich. I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Heather. Oh, we switched over. Great. Thanks. This is in Healdsburg, which, as Heather mentioned, is very much a tourist-based economy and lovely community that has, in our opinion, been really aggressive in addressing affordable housing issues. And this is a great story of that, and want to really call out the city for their collaboration on this. So in early 2019, the city was made aware of 3 properties. Actually, we'll start with the first, which is Montevina, which was being marketed in the market in an area that is experiencing a lot of conversion to second homes and other things. And they took this as an opportunity to tackle that issue by bringing it to our attention and working with us to facilitate the acquisition of this property. We would combine that property. We were looking at ways to model this to access tax credits and make it make sense, knowing that these unsubsidized properties on their own often do not meet the necessary requirements to make it work. It helps to bring along a property that doesn't need as much work and is basically already affordable. So we brought this one property together with Canyon Run, which was a 51 unit complex that we'd built about 15 years earlier. It started and was coming out of that compliance period. It was considered to be in reasonable condition, but certainly could also benefit from recapitalization. So, but then within a few weeks, while the negotiations were going on with the first of the three properties, we learned of two more properties, both of those of 8 units each, which we would never look at for a tax credit project except other. And the city offered to tie all three of those up for us and provide some initial earnest money that then would be converted at a later time. That was really attractive to us to conduct due diligence and to fully evaluate that project before moving forward. Next slide. And by the way, that's a picture in the screen there of Montevina, the first one I mentioned. So the next steps were to include detailed scoping of rehab costs of all three properties, as well as what we thought at the time was more limited scope for Canyon Run. These were fully occupied properties. I can't even recall if we had a vacant unit there at the time that we could go in and do more testing. But we did a P&A. We went through all of the systems and considered what we considered at the time to be a fairly hefty budget to upgrade these units. We also did a initial analysis of the incomes of the residents, and then when we were able to take ownership, we did a more elaborate certification of those incomes, and that's where we found that a number of those were actually over 80% AMI. I believe the number was 8. And there also were found almost as many units that were at the 60 to 80% range. And we knew that the 80% units would need to be permanently relocated under the model of having the entire project be eligible for tax credits. So the initial estimates of that rehab cost ranged from about 7.3 to 8.4 million in that first year of assessment. Just as a teaser to the end of the project, by the time it was done, that number would almost double. Next slide, please. So some of the major issues throughout the project. During our underwriting of the project, which was done with the help of CHPC, there were some challenges keeping track of all of the pieces that had to go into the transition from the Canyon Run Alone property that had its share of subordinate debt on it, plus the funds that had to be pulled together to make the whole project make sense for a full rehab. That right before closing, we discovered that one of those, not one of the old ones, but one of the bridge loan between the acquisition and the actual construction closing for LIHTC, one of those loans had kind of slipped through the cracks, and we had to scramble at the end of the construction closing to fill that gap, which we did for the most part through a collaboration of our tax credit investor, lender, the city. Everybody found a way to chip in to make this close, which it did 30 days later. So there were temporary relocation challenges in this tourist economy. including managing on-site vacancies to minimize the cost and inconvenience. We know in these properties, these folks are not used to the structure of having to find a separate place for them. And when you do these, it probably is good as early as you are in the project to, make peace with the fact that you're going to keep units vacant as much as possible until you get to that point where you're initiating the relocation. In Healdsburg, most of the hotels, based on the tourist industry, don't have rents that are or daily rates that match up even on a monthly rate basis with what makes sense. And I think we use them minimally at the end of the day. So so we talk about the relocation for over 80%, and that was a significant issue because we knew those would have to go. And we can talk a little bit about that. Looking forward, we'd like to look at options in which collaborating with city, county, other sources, find ways to fill the gap that would have created in a tax credit model to keep them if that were the case. And we figure that the cost of having a over 80% unit to a project from a tax credit standpoint is about 200,000 a unit in tax credit equity that you would lose by keeping those folks in place. But you would also save the cost of the relocation cost. So the net cost of that is about 150,000 per unit, which is significant. Other main issues during the construction had to do with scope creep, which in our case was dramatic. And the second picture here on the screen, which I don't know how big your screens are, but that's university apartments, which were 8 units. And what you can see there is that we had to take those units literally down to the studs. We actually had to do that in all 3 of the properties that we acquired, which was absolutely not in our intention at the time of acquisition or even during our assessment during the rehab period. It just was one issue after another that came up with dry rot, structural issues that were not able to be seen during the initial assessment. And ultimately, that's what we're looking at is something where I think by the end of the job, we looked at it and said that we could have torn these units down and built them cheaper than what we did. So we had to do enhanced scope. Some of it had to do with the building department and some of the things that they felt compelled to enforce. And I don't blame them, but there has to be some ways to look at these buildings and say, just because we're doing a major rehab doesn't mean it should necessarily trigger every possible upgrade that you'd like to see on those projects. It is just unfortunate. Next slide, please. So lessons learned. First of all, don't delay on tenant income certifications. Work that out with a seller that you can get in there early. It's quite difficult because sellers are not often friendly folks, and they're just looking to do the minimum. But it's something that you have to assess during that due diligence period to make sure that you're not going to be in that position where you have to dramatically relocate folks. I think that's unfortunate. Destructive testing, as many of you know who've done rehab, there's only so much that you can know without opening up walls. And opening up walls when there's folks living in those units is almost impossible. So as soon as you have a vacant unit, that's important to take a look at that. Again, it's difficult to do when you're not in control of the property, but you can work up language that they agree to that if you open it up and you don't close, you'll repair it in as good or better condition than you left it. Contingencies, expect the unexpected. I think people mostly underwrite projects with a 5% contingency on new construction and 10 on rehab, probably looking at 15 to 20 is more reasonable given what we see. I mean, this one probably it just it went beyond that. Choose contractors wisely, especially on complicated projects. Uh, we went with a contractor who didn't have much experience in the local market. They had good experience with occupied rehab, and it was a challenging. It was challenging. It was far from their location, and they brought the best people they could, but sometimes those people fell short. Over communicating with your tenants. I think often we had so many changes of schedule based on the complexities of doing a tax credit project. Um, and I think sometimes tenants were left in the dark when the delays continued for a number of months. That can create a lot of tension in the community if they don't feel up to date and knowing from, one week to the next when they're going to be relocating. We did the best we could, but I think that's something where over communicating is better than under communicating. Engaging entire team on solutions. We had a great team in terms of the design, the engineers, the contractors, the city, staff, management. It is important that they all are involved in some of these discussions and understand where things are going. Also, don't entirely depend on your consultants. I think we have to always have like a second set of eyes and ears on what people are proposing. I think that's important. And again, never assume appearances are what's behind the walls. Um, Build in those contingencies and hope for the best. Next slide. I guess that's the last slide. No, these are the sources and uses. I'm sorry. So we had about 18.6 million in tax credit equity that went into the project, a $9.9 million. Is that a permanent loan? I don't think maybe that is. And the carryback loan. Um, yeah, so one piece of this is important as well is you've got income from operations. Given that this project did go over, I'd say 4 years, actually 3 years of rehab, 2 years in getting to that point. Um, so that's an important piece. Let's take a look at the other side, the uses side. So the acquisitions, which again, Canyon Run was already in our ownership, so that's a purchase that was internal to the transaction. Um, the two small properties added up to close to $5 million, and Montevina was quite expensive as well. The rehab cost you saw earlier, $7 to $8 million. Ultimately, it ended up being $14 million. Massive change. And that's it. Time for questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Rich, and thanks for sharing all of the really important lessons learned for others who are considering doing this work. We have a few questions in the chat that I'm going to jump to. So the first was about how the city of Healdsburg was able to tie up the buildings. I think this is a question about just the seller's timeline for selling and how the city was able to sort of make sure that you were able to jump in as the buyer. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. We help them draft the LOIs and even the contracts for the purchase. The transition to us kind of in the driver's seat wasn't that long, but it was extremely helpful for them to come up with the funds that were able to make this happen. I think I'm sorry, LOI, letter of intent.
Oh,
Um,
sorry.
and yeah, I mean, I think it worked out fine. If I had if it would been me, I would have pushed harder on the sellers to come down on their price. But I think we were having this, tension between policy and, financial feasibility. And it was really important to them to win this deal. And so coming down on the price was a tough ask because we were certainly at risk of getting outbid. And we see that all the time. I put together LOIs, multiple times that we don't get because we can't make the numbers work. And we've had challenges in other situations where you're just overpaying doesn't pay. On the other hand, sometimes I have to tell you that I've lost a couple of deals recently in which I wouldn't pay the additional amount, and I was shocked to see that the people who outbid us actually got tax credits. So, but there's a risk that you don't get those tax credits.
Right, and as you learned, the rehab budgets can be quite high, so it's important to not overpay for properties. So one other question, I think we only have time for this one more. Well, it's actually two in one. But the relocation of residents and how that impacts your thinking as an affordable housing developer and your concerns about going after these kinds of unsubsidized affordable properties in smaller cities in particular. And the second part of that question is what can city councils do? What can local government do to support with this?
Yeah, I think that certainly is harder to do in the smaller towns, where there's not a lot of access to capital, and when that capital is available, it needs to be spread around among a number of projects that are vying for it. But yes, I think there is an opportunity for the local agencies to step in and do what we were talking about, like fill that 150,000 per unit gap on a project.
Excellent. All right, I'm going to pass it back to Matt, but thank you again so much, Rich, for this presentation and congratulations on the great work.
Thanks so much, Heather and Rich. It really is helpful to just see how much goes into making one of these preservation of unsubsidized affordable housing transactions work. It's really complicated, not for the faint of heart, but so glad that you were successful, Rich, you and Burbank Housing, at doing that. All right, the next topic is going to be taking a look at what does it take to preserve existing federally assisted, state assisted, both assisted affordable housing. And to help us with that, our Senior Director of Finance, Lauren Maddock, is going to have a conversation with one of the state's premier leaders in affordable housing preservation. Lauren, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt, and welcome everybody. Good morning. It's still morning. I'm so pleased to introduce Betsy McGovern Garcia. I've been working with Betsy since I started at the partnership in 2019. So she and I have had a lot of different interesting projects, but the ones she's going to present today, one is a state case study and the other is a federal, are super interesting to me as my role in portfolio recapitalization. Betsy has over 20 years of experience in affordable housing development and nonprofit organizational management. She's currently serving as the vice president for Self-Help Enterprises. That's after 9 years as a real estate development director. Betsy's work has resulted in construction of over 1,800 new multifamily homes. Self-Help also has developed 700 lots for home ownership, and then also acquisition, rehabilitation of over 400 at-risk units. Under Betsy's leadership, rental communities have evolved to include all-electric zero net energy development, battery storage, and climate resilient strategies. Betsy also launched Self-Help Enterprises work with permanent supportive housing, which includes development of 500 new permanent supportive housing units and extensive service provider contracts. Betsy's experience also includes a variety of homeownership financial models, including new market tax credits, community land trusts. Betsy has an MBA and serves on the boards of the San Joaquin Valley Housing Collaborative, Housing California, and the National Rural Housing Coalition. So without further ado, Betsy, please, let's dive into these case studies. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Lauren, for that great introduction. And I would say that none of our projects would be possible without Lauren and the balance of the team from CHPC, CHP supporting those efforts. So really, really appreciate their partnership. Just a bit about Self Help Enterprises. We are a 60-year-old nonprofit organization. We were founded in 1965 when three farm worker families got together and wanted to improve their housing conditions. We pioneered the mutual self-help method of homeownership construction, where our families work in groups of 10 to 12, building their own homes, working 40 hours a week, framing and pouring foundations, framing walls, all the things it takes to build a home. And through that method of homeownership development, we have developed over 6,600 new homeownership units. About 30 years ago, we started actively working. Actually, about 40 years ago now, we started actively working in rental housing. We own and operate over 3,100 units of rental housing. We also operate programs, first-time home buyer, owner-occupied rehab, accessory dwelling units, and are very active in water and wastewater. So we continue to deliver water to households impacted by the drought. We provide technical assistance to small districts looking to improve their water or wastewater infrastructure, and we provide below market rate financing and technical assistance for new water wells and consolidations of districts. So really can distill our work into water and housing, and in totality, we have supported over 87,000 individuals since our inception. Next slide, please, Sierra. So wanted to spend some time talking about the first round of the Portfolio Reinvestment Program, which is the state of California program. The first round focused on projects with housing and community development, state HCD, regulatory agreements that were expiring before December of 2032. We happen to have three of these projects in our portfolio, totaling 160 units. And these properties are located in Tulare and Merced counties in the San Joaquin Valley, which is our service territory. Do have a misprint on this slide. The total lending through PRP for these three properties was actually 38.5 million, which ended up being about 240,000 per unit. So this is a very generous program that really focuses investments on preserving these affordable housing units. The really great thing about the PRP program is that developer fees are included. So we had funding to pay for our staff time. We had funding to pay for relocation and really do focused, intentional work with our residents, preparing them for these rehab opportunities. This preservation work for us also has been a way to kind of balance out new construction, balance out the workload, make sure that we have pipeline work while we're waiting for other new construction activities to come online. And for us, it's really about ensuring that these are high quality units in perpetuity. We have never sold any of our rental communities. Once we come into a community, we are your neighbor permanently. And so we really actively seek opportunities to preserve these units. Through these three rehab and preservation projects, we were also able to leverage the low income weatherization program funding. These are climate investments that are available to make really deeply targeted energy efficiency and renewable energy investments. And so through these three projects, we leverage $1.3 million of LIWIP. We're able to dramatically improve energy efficiency, add renewable solar PV, and include elements that focus on water conservation. Next slide, please. So the next project I want to talk about, we actually had a batch of two, what we call HCD legacy projects. Literally with both of these projects, staff members at HCD called us and said, we've got owners of these properties. One was a group of dentists that had invested in the properties in the 1990s. The other was a family investment. There was turnover. Heirs were now trying to run these rental communities, wasn't sufficient rent income coming off the properties to make the maintenance repairs that were needed to preserve the communities. And so HCD reached out to see if we would step in and preserve this community. Dinuba Manor is 24 units in the city of Dinuba, which is in Tulare County. It's a rural community. The community was originally funded with the Rental Housing Construction Program, RHCP, and the original loan was $662,000. Imagine a time where we could get $600,000 and build a 24-unit project. It blows my mind. Have about $500,000 of accrued interest, so we were stepping in and assuming a $1.1 million loan. This one, we actually bought out the general partner and the investor interest. So we paid $55,000 to buy out the members of the limited partnership. Once we had control of the limited partnership, we transferred the property to one of our limited liability companies, an LLC. The project was built in 1991 and it was originally syndicated with tax credits, so that allowed us to grandfather the residents. So if we have current residents that are higher income, they were grandfathered in. And we were successful in securing a PRP award in the amount of $6 million. Acquired the site in 2019, got PRP in 2024. So we did hold the asset, stabilize it for 5 years, and then secured the PRP for rehab. And this was eligible round two, even though there's a 55-year affordability covenant that doesn't expire until 2047. They allowed round two of PRP to cover legacy program projects through HCD. So this one was eligible because of the RHCP investments. Next slide, please. So the next project is Mount Whitney, which is a 29-unit project in Lindsay, also Tulare County, also a rural community. You can see on the bottom left that it is a beautiful historic building. It was a hotel that was built in 1929. And then it was acquired and rehabbed in 1996. Although we have that beautiful exterior brick facade, there are structural issues with the building, challenges with settling, and then a variety of just challenges based on the age of the building. This one had original funding through the California Housing Rehabilitation Program. That was a $1.7 million loan that they obtained in the 90s to do the rehab and conversion from a hotel. Same thing, we came in and purchased it for assumed debt, worked directly with HCD to preserve this community. We acquired the site in April of 2022, and 2 years later, were awarded PRP in the amount of $6.3 million. So we'll be doing a full scope rehab. This one also was syndicated originally, thankfully, so we're able to grandfather in all the residents. This is a senior community, and actually the majority of the residents living in the community are at 30% of area median income. So we really didn't need to use that grandfathering because they are all, the majority of them, extremely low income. And I talked about the structural issues. We also have started opening walls and finding mold, and we'd had significant ADA challenges. You can imagine an elevator shaft that was put in 1929, which apparently back then people were very, very small, don't have the clearances for things like wheelchairs. We had to get special equipment to evacuate folks down the stairwell. And we're doing everything that we can to upgrade for ADA, but there are just some things that we're unable to do based on the original design of the building. Next slide. So the next batch of properties I want to talk about are USDA 515 properties. There are a significant amount of these properties that are coming up in the next 5 to 10 years that truly have expiring covenants. And with all of these, if we had not intervened to acquire these properties, they would have been released by USDA to convert to market rate housing. So some of these communities, Mariposa Oaks, Valley Oaks, and Oakhurst, these are on the gateway to Yosemite. These are very attractive retirement communities, very high rents. And all of the people living in these communities would have been displaced. Additionally, once the loan is paid off, the residents are no longer eligible for rental assistance. So it's absolutely imperative that we as a industry step in and preserve these units, preserve the rental assistance. These first two that we did, Mariposa Oaks in 2019 and Valley Oaks in 2020, both right around 24 units each. Both of these worked as a 9% syndication with just the USDA financing and the 9% credits. So these go through a program where USDA offers an incentive to acquire them. The incentive is in the form of a new USDA loan to purchase the properties and keep them affordable. So we completed those two projects and we're currently working on a batch of 4 additional properties. We started working on these in December of 2019. Fast forward 5.5 years later, we acquired them in September. This was through the sale to nonprofit program, so we had to acquire them under one of our nonprofits. And we did that in order to secure the new USDA financing. And we are in the process of resyndicating them. We are not competitive with just the USDA loan, so we're bringing in funding like capital magnet fund, home funding from our jurisdictions in order to compete for the 9% credits. We do assume the existing debt and then take on a new USDA 515 loan that is a below market rate loan, typically 1 to 3%. It is fully amortizing, so we're making payments on that loan. USDA underwriting is lengthy. You have to have USDA appraisals and capital needs assessment. They have a thing called the PAT, which is the preliminary assessment tool. If you change one input, it can spiral through 17 tabs. It's really a lot of fun. But what comes with this is the ability to preserve these units. And we have rental assistance on the majority of the units. So good, strong cash flow, good income to support the projects. We really just need to address the capital needs. There is a pilot program that just recently got extended called decoupling. Previously, you had to have a USDA loan in order to get USDA rental assistance. They're starting to allow the decoupling of those on some properties, but for us, preservation meant acquisition, really intensive capital investment to rehab the units, and then preservation of the rental assistance to make sure that they're affordable in perpetuity. Next slide, please. So here's a sampling of the properties. All of these properties were built between 1976 and 1978, so they are almost the same age as I am, fun fact. There's 4 of them. They are all either 23 or 24 units. There must have been something in the program because we have now 6 properties that we're preserving between 23 and 24 units each. You can see here the new USDA loan amount and the amount of tax credits and other funding in each of the projects. All of these properties are senior housing and they all are cinder block construction. So that brings up a significant amount of challenges with ADA, the accessibility improvements for the projects. Very difficult to move a cinder block wall to get turning radiuses in a bathroom. room. So taking each one property by property and working through those challenges. This batch of properties is a total of 94 units. All of them had loans that were going to be maturing within the next 5 years. It is a true preservation activity. They would have converted to market rate otherwise. In total, our new USDA financing is right around $7 million. Next slide, please. And so some lessons learned with all of these preservation activities. We had really hoped when we started the second batch of USDA properties to do some scattered site syndications. It's extremely challenging with the individual USDA loans to pair those up as scattered site syndications. Ideally, we'd love to see the QAP, the Qualified Allocation Plan for the state of California, allow for scattered site syndications over multiple counties. We would have loved to do these in one shot instead of 4 separate tax credit applications and closings. So we think there's some work that can be done to add flexibility to scattered site financing approaches within the state of California. When working with USDA properties, it's really important to understand your return to owner, which is what they call the equivalent of the asset management fee. So for nonprofits owning USDA properties, the return to owner, the fee is only $7,500 a year. Once it goes to a corporation or a for-profit, which the limited partnership will be when we syndicate these properties, there's a different formula. It gets closer to 30,000, which is what we'd see on a normal new construction for asset management fee. So understanding that RTO and the budget implications is very important. With every preservation activity, I think the number one thing to remember is be patient. You're dealing with assumed debt. You're dealing with family owners and heirs, dealing with government agencies, and I think first and foremost, dealing with residents who are going to be impacted by this work. Often they are scared if their units are at risk of converting to market rate and they're at risk of losing their rental assistance. So being patient, working through it, and taking the time to preserve these properties is absolutely essential. And with that, early and frequent resident communication, communicating schedules, relocation plans, what's going to be happening in each of the units, and making sure that there's a really robust strategy in place for communicating with residents, supporting residents. We tend to pay for moving expenses. We've started using a combination of hotels and Airbnbs and house rentals to make things more comfortable and make things easier for our residents during the rehab scope. We do try to do all of our unit turns in 21 days, so minimizing the displacement of your residents is absolutely essential. We've looked at a number of preservation activities where there were not previously tax credits, and a lot of the residents were over 60 or 80% AMI. Our organization will not displace a 90% AMI household to serve a 70% AMI household. And so really understanding the ability to grandfather your residents and not trigger displacement with your preservation activity is essential. And then understanding the accessibility and disability upgrades that are required. Rich mentioned it really, really perfectly earlier when he said you go in for permitting. The jurisdiction wants everything under the sun when you're doing a rehab. And collectively as communities and practitioners, we need to acknowledge that preserving the units and the affordability and the physical condition of the major systems is the first target here. And when we pile on all these additional requirements, it often renders them infeasible. And so working with our jurisdictions, and then sometimes our funders want us to make units into ADA units where we have non-ADA families living in those. We saw those with the PRP activities. So they might have a bathtub where they, use it to get baths to their 2-year-old children. And then they come back post rehab and it's a roll-in shower. So you really have to talk to your residents and understand and communicate what the rehab scope entails. Beware when opening walls. Rich talked about this also. You find all kinds of fun things in the walls, and having a really robust contingency line item is important. We absolutely need ongoing funding in the PRP program and in the low income weatherization program. These are essential resources that allow us to preserve our units and increase the energy efficiency and ultimately the operating financial feasibility of these communities. And one other thing that's not in here is understand your reserve accounts. Anytime you're negotiating an acquisition of a property that you're preserving, you should discuss who's keeping the reserves. Are they going to staying with the seller, going to the buyer? How are you going to refund reserves to make sure they're sufficient going forward, and making sure that your maintenance reserve lines up with your capital needs assessment and what your ongoing needs are with the community. Next slide, Sierra. And with that, Lauren, I will turn it back to you for questions.
Right. So we're running a little behind, but Betsy, there were 2 questions in the chat. The first was regard to the PRP projects. Specifically Dinuba and Mount Whitney, the regulatory agreements were not expiring in the 10-year timeframe, so you were able to go in under a waiver, correct?
It wasn't a waiver. They expanded round 2 to include legacy programs, and that included California Natural Disaster Assistance Program, Special User Housing Rehab Program, Rental Housing Construction Program, Family Housing Demonstration Program. So they took some of these older HCD programs where they knew they had assets that were starting to deteriorate, and they made those eligible for PRP.
Excellent. And then in terms of over-income residents, you did not syndicate with tax credits Dinuba and Mount Whitney, so you didn't have to worry about that there. But with the 4 elderly projects, did you have over-income residents in those?
So 3 out of 4 of those, interestingly, were syndicated originally, so it's not an issue there. And we tend to find with senior housing that we have low income folks living in those units already. So we do not have any displacement with any of those activities.
Excellent. And, just for edification for the question that was in the box, in the event that you did have truly over income residents, over 80% AMI, then, self-help would have had to make a decision whether to permanently relocate or just not take tax credits on those units.
That's right. And we have purchased properties from a peer before and gotten rehab assistance in those communities. And we had 2 households that were over like 120% AMI. And so we did work with them on relocation. We would find them a comparable unit and provide a relocation package.
Excellent. Thank you, Betsy. So I'm going to hand it back to Matt.
Thank you both so much. Betsy, that was amazing. The amount of effort and complexity of all those properties and avoiding displacement. Really hats off to you guys as well as to Burbank. So we're now at the point where we're going to lift up the policy issues that these panels and the prior reports have brought to our attention. And to help us do that, I'm going to turn this over to Housing California's Senior Legislative and Regulatory Affairs Manager. That's quite a title, Natalie. But thank you so much for being here and helping us with this policy discussion.
You're right, Matt. It's always a mouthful for me too. But good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here with you talking about this incredibly important topic. And as Matt mentioned, I have the honor of both moderating and also being a panelist on this segment of today's webinar that will focus on some of the policy solutions that we advocates have been focused on recently, both looking backwards to last year and also this year, and what some of the really exciting policies related to preservation that our organizations and our partners are working on. And just to kind of frame things up, I think that the affordable housing advocates, and really especially California Housing Partnership and Enterprise, have been doing an amazing job in recent years, leading the way in reshaping the narrative about how important preservation is, and that when the state, when the legislature thinks about increasing the supply of affordable homes, there are two sides of that coin. There's production, which legislators tend to think more about because, then you get to claim credit for shiny new buildings, but that preservation is equally important if we're thinking about how to holistically increase the supply of affordable homes. So with that, I want to introduce our two esteemed panelists, Justine Marcus, who is the Director of Policy for Enterprise Community Partners Northern California, and Taisha Watts, Associate Director of Policy Advocacy at Housing California. And first, I'll turn it over to Taisha to talk about some of the preservation policies that the California Housing Partnership is leading the way on.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Natalie, for that introduction, and thank you all for being here today. One thing I want to start with is underscoring exactly what the importance of preservation is. It's ultimately about the people. Every affordable home we save results in a family being able to stay in their home, a community being able to stay together. And right now, the data is telling us something urgent. Many HCD regulatory agreements are set to expire. So we need to figure out how do we implement policies to preserve our affordable home stock. Many at-risk properties simply don't have access to capital that they need to stay viable. They can't secure enough private financing. Existing public resources often fall short, but that doesn't mean that we can't be intentional. Earlier, we talked about the portfolio reinvestment program and seeing how critical it was for developers such as Self-Help Enterprise being able to streamline a lot of their developments. So getting into one of our policy solutions, we are actually introducing AB 750. Next slides here. Thank you. AB 750, once this bill is amended, it's going to be able to expand access to the portfolio reinvestment program, which is a game changer. It provides flexible capital specifically for developments that are at risk of converting to market rate or can't access enough financing to complete needed rehabilitation. We're also advocating for funding for the low-income weatherization program. We talk about ensuring that there is a sustainability component to when we are trying to preserve our affordable housing stock, being able to implement upgrades that result in reducing our gas emissions, reducing operating costs, and also being able to deliver lower energy bills for residents. Another policy solution underway is AB 2020. A lot of times, developers need the flexibility to utilize their already cash flows that they have on one property. And right now, they're not able to do that. With AB 2020, we'll actually be able to allow for developers to transfer reserves between projects. So in simpler terms, if you have one development that has positive cash flow, once this bill is implemented, you'll be able to transfer the reserves from that project to a struggling project. It's oftentimes about not necessarily needing new funding, but utilizing what you already have. And then another policy solution underway is AB 2026, which addresses one of the very real challenges of how we are seeing a lot of developments being financially unviable is monitoring fees. Oftentimes, these monitoring fees can make or break a deal. So we are actually working to waive these monitoring fees so that you free up capital beforehand so that the development can be seen to fruition. Another policy from last year that the CHP was happy to sponsor is now allowing for local jurisdictions to include in their annual progress reports the number of existing affordable housing units rehabilitated. So this elevates preservation by making sure that we actually track and report the amount of units that we are preserving so that when it comes time to advocate for funding and advocating for why they need to be rehabilitated, we have the data to prove it. And at the end of the day, if we want to take the promises we've seen in places like Burbank Housing and the amazing work also that Self-Help Enterprises is doing to scale it across the state, we need to act now and implement these different policies that uplift rehabilitation and making sure that we're not having a one-sided conversation to where we're only focusing on production, but preserving our housing stock that we have already invested in and seeing a return on investment to our communities that need it the most. So I'll stop here and I will turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Justine.
Thanks so much, Taisha. And I really just want to underscore and appreciate you framing up this section by talking about, the real motivation behind all of our preservation work, which is the folks who are living in these homes and in these communities today. We're throwing around so many different types of strategies and policy solutions. It's the existing affordable, how do we keep it affordable? It's struggling properties, how do we keep them afloat? And then I'm going to talk a little bit about more of the acquisition preservation for currently unsubsidized, kind of connecting to Matt's research. But the common thread here is keeping folks in their homes, preventing displacement, preventing homelessness, and growing and maintaining our stock of affordable housing, right? That's the common thread. Do you mind going to the next slide, please? I'm going to share a couple more bills that are relevant to this conversation. The first is SB 1091, authored by Senator Caballero. This would create the Community Anti-Displacement Preservation Program, also known as CAP. This program has been many years in the making. We're really proud to be co-sponsoring this bill this year alongside Housing California, public advocates in the California Community Land Trust Network. This came out of the Stable Homes Coalition and really, years of work with partners, including with our friends at CHP. And this would create a new funding program at the state level to fund the acquisition and preservation of currently unrestricted homes and bringing them into our deed restricted stock of affordable housing. And Natalie will touch on this a little bit later, but the key for this program getting across the finish line this year is the funding for it, right? And that will hopefully be coming from the state bond. Next up, we have AB 2089, authored by Assemblymember Ward, which we're really happy to be working on with CHP and the California Council for Affordable Housing. Another common theme besides preservation and residents is that we all really enjoy working together, because I feel like I'm saying that we're working on these various bills just with the other folks on the screen. So it's really a collaborative work. This bill is focused on streamlining, modernizing, and really creating more transparency in the welfare tax exemption process. And this bill, if enacted, will have benefits for kind of affordable housing across the board, new production, preservation of existing, act rehab. But I want to really lift up one piece of this that was really informed by the experience of acquisition preservation practitioners at the local level. And my colleague, Heather Bromfield, who's moderated the session earlier, was really instrumental in, bubbling up what are we hearing from practitioners and how can we bring that into the state legislative context. So this will in particular require county assessors to make it clear and transparent on their website what type of documentation, forms and backup documentation are necessary for the income certification process. And this has been a particular challenge for properties that aren't using the standard kind of LIHTC forms because they're not LIHTC funded projects. And then lastly, I want to lift up AB 670, which was signed into law last year. This was Quirk Silva, Assemblymember Quirk Silva bill. And this was a bill we were really thrilled to work on with the Public Interest Law Project and the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority. And this was creating that incentive for local jurisdictions to do act rehab preservation by allowing that to be counted toward their annual progress reports. And I'll shout out my colleague, Emia Leano-Atanasio, who led the charge on this bill last year. And I'm going to quickly say a little bit about budget before I pass it back to Natalie, if you don't mind going to the next slide, please, which is that, all three of our organizations are playing a big role in advocating for resources in this year's budget. course, the budget is very complementary to the larger efforts around a bond, but we know we need these near-term budget dollars to keep, well, keep the pipeline moving on the production side and protect homes and residents today on the preservation side. So our budget ask includes $200 million for the portfolio reinvestment program, which Taisha mentioned earlier. And it also includes a 60 million kind of set aside within MHP to support affordable housing providers who are facing extreme financial challenges. And, just to underscore this, we've we've had some really great discussion about kind of expiring use preservation today, and then about ACK rehab of unsubsidized. And then there is this kind of other group, right, which is affordable housing that it's not necessarily at the end of its affordability covenant, but it's having sustainability challenges due to operational costs. And, here you have things like rising insurance rates, utility costs, vacancies that are driving that. And we see that as another really important part of the preservation puzzle. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Natalie.
Thanks, Justine, and thanks, Taisha. As you can tell, we have a lot going on in the legislature this year, and the three of our organizations do work really closely to move this agenda forward together. Next slide, please. So I know you all engage with us on a lot of different fronts. So I think it's nice to be able to tie the conversation that we're having today about preservation solutions to the affordable housing bond efforts that I know many of you are watching very closely, and all of us on this call have as a top priority to see get over the finish line this year. But in case you don't know, there are two legislative vehicles for a $10 billion affordable housing bond, SB 417 from Senator Cabaldon and AB 736 from Assemblymember Wicks. And the programs in the bond really are intended to address the spectrum of housing, homelessness, and homeownership needs, one of which is the preservation of affordable housing for all of the reasons that we've talked about on the call today. So the bond fund would fund two preservation programs. One is the CAP program that Justine just mentioned, and that is moving through the legislature as SB 1091, that will create this, quick source of capital to make it possible for developers to acquire and rehabilitate naturally occurring affordable housing on the market. It includes $500 million to stand up that program, and also $800 million for the portfolio reinvestment program. And I really just want to emphasize that we see funding through the budget and the bond as complements, not substitutes. Funding through the bond, if passed by the voters this November, won't be available likely until early 2028, which would leave us with a year-long gap in resources being available. So funding the budget really is what we think of as the bridge to the bond. So that's why we're advocating for some of the same programs on multiple fronts. Next slide. So I also want to tie this all back to the Roadmap Home, which hopefully you've all heard of as well. But this is the effort that Housing California and the California Housing Partnership have been leading for several years now to really lay out an evidence-based pathway to end the housing and homelessness crisis. The updated version of the Roadmap Home that was released a few months ago includes 66 policies that would help us end the affordable housing and homelessness crisis, and has, I think, three key policies related to preservation that are in the document. Two you've heard a lot about on this call already. The first is to create the CAP program. The second is to expand the portfolio reinvestment program to non-HCD projects. But the third that I want to spend just a minute on here is one that I know many of you think a lot about when you think about the topic of preservation, and is deeply tied to that larger scale goal that we all have, in the preservation world of protecting tenants, making sure that low-income renters aren't displaced from their homes. And that is the TOPA COPA policies, Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act and Community Opportunity to Purchase Act. And what both of those types of policies really intend to do is give either tenants, if it's TOPA, or nonprofits, if it's COPA, a first right of refusal to purchase buildings, market rate buildings that usually low income renters are living in as they come on the market to preserve them as affordable. This has been a really politically difficult topic for us to advance at the state level. There are many interests in the real estate world who tend to be opposed to TOPA COPA policies, but it's an area where we continue to try to push at the state level. So last year, for example, there was a bill from Senator Perez, a very narrow COPA bill that would have just applied to disaster affected areas that came about after the LA fires. That unfortunately did not make it very far through the process, given the strong opposition. And this year, there is another narrow COPA bill, TOPA COPA bill, to allow mobile home residents a first right of refusal that's facing a lot of political opposition. And I really just bring that up to kind of share some examples of how hard it is to move these types of policies at the state level. But I will say, kind of as a note of optimism, that we really see the CAP program as an integral part of making a one day successful statewide TOPA COPA policy work, because the CAP program provides that quick access to capital that tenants or community-based developers or nonprofits need to take advantage of a TOPA COPA policy. So passing the CAP bill, securing the funding through the budget, or sorry, through the bond will be a key ingredient to one day implementing statewide TOPA COPA. Okay, so with that, I think there might be a next slide. Perfect. Before we open it up to Q&A, I just wanted to ask Justine and Taisha, we had two great panels before this one, with some really great case studies of what preservation work is looking like on the ground. Are there any responses that you'd like to offer to what we heard, either from the presentation about the data or the case studies that we heard about from a couple of our nonprofit developers?
One thing I would just add, and you know, I've heard from each of these organizations before about their work, and it still blows me away. I mean, just the level of complexity and depth in these projects, especially where you have residents already living there today. What I would maybe just add is that, you know, these two organizations are, decades into doing this work, which is fantastic. And we also have a growing number of organizations who are kind of newly getting into this work and are kind of building that capacity. And so something that I know we see a lot and we hear a lot from our local partners is the need to pair these policy solutions and new resources with capacity building and technical assistance. And I will just note that the CAP program, SB 1091, does, include a portion of new dollars to that program to be used for technical assistance to help community-based organizations successfully use the program. So hopefully in, a decade, we have an even larger cohort of incredible organizations who are, working at that level and are able to kind of build their internal systems and best practices for doing this work, because we know it's vital and we know it can be complicated. And I think the case studies really showcase that.
No, I think you summed it up, Justine. I would say that even underscoring Burbank's housing case study, you showed that you have these experienced developers, but outside factors such as, rising cost and administrative burdens add on to the inability for a lot of these developments to proceed. But having opportunities to hear these case studies helps inform our policy solutions and how we can ensure that we are creating change at the state level, working with our practitioners on the ground, and then combining our organization's expertise.
Great, thank you for that. So I think we have about 10 minutes for Q&A here. I am not seeing questions in the Q&A box, but Sierra, if you're monitoring those, or Matt, if you had questions that you wanted to ask of Taisha and Justine and I think now's the opportunity.
Thanks so much, Natalie and Justine and Taisha. I'm not seeing any other questions in the Q&A either right now. I think you guys have covered a lot. And I would say one other aspect that we haven't touched on this year that we will probably talk about next year is the power of the state preservation notice law in helping both protect residents who are in place and also helping to alert local jurisdictions relating to the earlier question about what Healdsburg could be doing when a property that has an existing regulatory agreement or subsidy reaches the end of that term and could be converted. So that notice law is incredibly important into our ability to know what's happening and to residents to defend their rights in these situations. So we'll be talking more about that next year. But that was the one topic that I think we didn't really get into this year that I thought of. And I think with that, I'm just going to thank you all very, very much. This was a great discussion, and I know you all are juggling a lot right now in the Capitol with some other very hot topics. So I'm just going to close this out and thank everyone who showed up for this. We had 210 people at one point, and we really appreciate everyone's interest. And a big, big thank you to all of you who presented today and all of you who've showed up, as well as the folks who made this possible behind the scenes, whose names are now in the chat for all of you. And that's Sierra Beal and Hilda Moranis. So thank you all. We'll hope to see you, next year for another one of these, and before then for another type of webinar. All right. Take care, everybody.
Have a good rest of your day, everyone.